Hello, 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 and welcome back to Behind the Walls of the World's Psychiatric Hospitals. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup, and today we're going to dive back into the history of Volterra Lunatic Asylum in Italy. This is going to be a very history-heavy episode, even more so than usual, so get excited if that's your thing. Trigger warnings for this episode include mention of outdated and ableist language, fascist policies, barbaric forms of mental health treatment, and patient abuse. Sources for this episode include the Volterra Lunatic Asylum website, a few Britannica articles on the history of Italy and the rise of fascism, and all other sources will be listed at the end of the episode transcript. So for now, come on in and get comfortable as we go behind the walls of Volterra Lunatic Asylum. We left off last week around the start of World War I, and just to back up a little bit and recap the historical context, Italy had been unified into one kingdom in 1861. The first several decades were rather turbulent, leading to increased poverty, social unrest, and emigration, especially from southern Italy. By the turn of the 20th century, Giovanni Giolitti had become prime minister. He actually would serve as prime minister 5 times over the course of about 3 decades, but his longest stints were in the early 1900s. Giolitti wasn't a perfect leader by any means, but he worked to put forth a progressive social agenda that eased tensions around Italy. He introduced labor laws such as the 12-hour workday and mandated that children had to be at least 12 years old to work, at least 15 years old in, quote, dangerous jobs. He declared that Sundays would be a day off from work. And in retrospect, this kind of seems like the bare minimum, but that gives you an idea of how bad things were before. Like, sorry your 8-year-old can't work 16-hour days anymore, Pietro, but he's got to stay home and, be a kid. Because of the policies of Giolitti, the first decade of the 20th century started to show the beginning of progress. I imagine that some people had hope for the first time in their lives. The death rate even dropped. In 1889, the death rate was around 27%, but by 1913 it had dropped to 19.43% due to medical and hygienic advances. Meanwhile, in Volterra, the hospital was expanding rapidly. Dr. Luigi Scabbia was actively turning the hospital into a village, so there was a new building constructed almost every year. We mentioned several of these in the last episode. One of Giolitti's social policies that affected the asylum was the increased budget for staffing. He also appointed a Directorate General of Public Health, which helped oversee the asylums in Italy. And this would have been good news for the hospital. In less good news, Italy had been involved in the Italo-Turkish War from 1911 to 1912, which ended with Italy's occupation of Libya. You'd think that would make him popular among other politicians, but it didn't. A number of leaders from other parties became increasingly disillusioned with Giolitti's leadership, and he ended up resigning in March of 1914. Giolitti recommended the conservative Antonio Salandra to serve as his replacement. And that brings us to the summer of 1914. We know the story. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, and a month later, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, kickstarting what would later be known as the Great War. And initially, Italy wanted to stay out of the conflict. No thank you, we're staying neutral. There had been enough tumult under the past decades, and they finally had occupation of Libya. They were good. Giolitti believed that Italy entering the war would be foolish, as their military was not prepared for the task. Salandra, however, was kind of side-eyeing things to see what Italy could gain from it. After all, they were part of the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary, so all they had to do was play defense, right? Eventually, Giolitti and Salandra would end up opposing one another due to their differing views on whether Italy should enter the war. You can imagine how stressful this would be for civilians in Italy during this time. They must have been watching carefully to see what was happening around them and worried that everything they'd just gained would be taken from them. They'd already been through a period of starvation and disease. Would another one be coming again soon? Back at Volterra, Dr. Scabbia just kept trucking with his original plans. War or no war, he had a hospital to direct. And in 1914, the Levi Pavilion was completed. It was named after a physician from Prato, Dr. Carlo Levi, who had practiced during the second half of the 19th century. The Levi Pavilion was designed for women patients, most of them who had been admitted voluntarily. And yet, somehow it was also known as the Screaming Ward. So, I don't know, take that as you will. The women who resided at Levi had more freedom than other patients. They could take on small tasks in the social centers of the hospital, such as embroidery or painting. They could make purchases at the asylum's shop or accompany staff to do shopping. In short, these patients were more autonomous and treatment-focused than other patients around the hospital. Life continued on at Volterra as mumblings of war continued. In April 1915, Italy signed a secret pact called the Treaty of London, which was between Italy and members of the Triple Entente, the UK, France, and Russia. Under the terms of the secret pact, Italy was going to leave the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary and join the Triple Entente. It would essentially mean declaring war against their former allies. Giolitti, meanwhile, had no idea about the Treaty of London. Even though he wasn't prime minister anymore, he still played a major role in politics. Most of the Italian parliament opposed the war, but nationalist crowds pushed for Italy to enter the war. A week after the Treaty of London had been signed, Italy officially revoked its place in the Triple Alliance. The politics of all this gets convoluted, but Salandra tried to resign in May of 1915, but Giolitti refused to return to his place as prime minister. I can almost see him putting up his hands and saying, "Oh no, you got yourself into this mess. You can deal with it." Giolitti ended up leaving politics and completely peaced out until the end of the war. On May 23rd, 1915, Italy officially declared war on Austria-Hungary. One of the pro-war agitators was a young journalist and editor named Benito Mussolini. Mussolini was interested in how the war could benefit Italy's hope to expand, and he hoped it might also overthrow capitalism. With the support of the Triple Entente, Mussolini was able to form his own newspaper, which he called Il Popolo d'Italia, the people of Italy. And here, I want you to imagine that you're setting a kettle on the stove, and click, the heat has just been turned on. A year later, in June 1916, Salandra resigned as prime minister after a series of military failures. Paolo Boselli took his place, although he wouldn't end up serving for very long. During the summer of 1917, there were anti-war riots that broke out around Italy. The people had had enough, but unfortunately it wouldn't be the end. In October 1917, one battle, which ended up being known as the Caporetto disaster, ended up being the last straw. This single battle, according to Britannica, left 11,000 Italian soldiers dead, 29,000 injured, 280,000 taken prisoner. About 350,000 Italian soldiers deserted or went missing, and 400,000 people became refugees. After this disaster, Prime Minister Boselli resigned. I think about what it must have been like to live in Italy during this time. Most civilians didn't want to be part of the war. Food was already heavily rationed throughout the country. Many people were forced to leave the country and move to the city, which led to overpopulation and increased disease and crime. They had just started to make some meager gains under Giolitti's leadership, and now they were being threatened because some people in the government wanted to expand Italy. Please. The chasm between those who opposed the war and those who continued to argue for its merits grew wider and wider. Remember our kettle on the stove? It's starting to heat up. The war had larger systemic ramifications, of course. In the field of health, soldiers were returning with severe physical injuries, disease, self-mutilation, and mental health problems that had never been seen before. There was a vast number of men on the front lines who shot themselves in the hand or foot, just severe enough to be taken off the battlefield and given convalescence for a couple of months. Maybe, just maybe, the war would end and they wouldn't have to go back. But this was risky because getting caught for intentional self-harm could mean imprisonment. And for those who attempted to escape the Caporetto disaster this way, the punishment could mean death. What complicated all of this was that many of the doctors throughout Italy had been drafted for the war efforts. So medical hospitals and asylums were left short-staffed at a time when they were needed most. As a very disturbing side note, the eugenics movement had started in Italy just before the war, around 1913. It was proposed at one point by what group I don't know. The people deemed, quote, not normal would be sent to the front lines in a way to let nature take its course. The idea was that anyone who today we would say has an intellectual disability, epilepsy, Down syndrome, or a developmental disorder would be sent first into battle to eradicate them. And this thought was so horrific, and fortunately, it ended up not happening. After the Caporetto disaster, civilians in particular began actively rebelling against the war and war efforts. The new Prime Minister, Vittorio Emanuele Orlando, attempted to rally the troops and push forward just a bit longer. A year later, in October 1918, the Italians won a final, decisive victory at the Battle of Vittorio Veneto. The war was over for Italy in November 1918. Truth be told, though, it was more about the internal collapse of Austria-Hungary and Germany than about any Italian military feats. Following the Great War, there was severe division and bitterness around Italy. The consequences of the war had been significant. 4,060 people deemed insane, 3,260 deemed dumb, 74,620 maimed, 507,193 left dead. There were economic problems, and unemployment skyrocketed to 2 million as returning soldiers looked for work. According to Britannica, many workers, peasants, socialists, and unionists were disgusted by the costs of the conflict and looked to other countries like Russia and Germany who were going through their own revolutions. That kettle, it's almost boiling. 1919 and 1920 were known in Italy as Biennio Rosso, or 2 red years. There were so many strikes as people advocated for higher pay. There was rioting and looting, especially in the north and center of the country. And while riots must have been frightening at times, they showed one positive sign: that people still had a voice, still had agency, still had freedom. And they wouldn't have that for much longer. In March 1919, the now former journalist Benito Mussolini founded the Fasci di Combattimento, or fighting leagues, known simply as fascists. According to Britannica, quote, the group's first program was a mishmash of radical nationalist ideas with strong doses of anti-clericalism and republicanism. Proposals included the confiscation of war profits, the 8-hour day, and the vote for women, end quote. After all, A fighting league isn't going to win anyone over without a little buy-in. Our kettle, it's now whistling loud enough for everyone to hear. Back in Volterra, the war had had devastating effects on patient care. Not only had there been fewer staff because of the draft, but the food had been highly rationed as well. And mind you, I don't think they got all that much food to begin with. 3 more buildings had been completed during this time, the end of the first big push of construction. In 1916, the Beefy Pavilion was completed. This building was intended for housing agitated and semi-agitated patients. As a result, it had holding cells for patients who required seclusion. In 1917, the Ramazzini Pavilion was finished. It had been built mostly by using the labor of Austrian prisoners of war. Now, this building had an interesting setup. The bottom floors served as a mill and pasta factory, whereas the upper floors housed the patients and workers assigned to that service. This way, they could remain as self-sufficient as possible. Finally, in 1918, the Claude Bernard Pavilion was completed. This building served as a social center of the asylum. The ground floor was previously the old kitchen, but went on to include a hospital supermarket, hairdressing rooms for men and women, a bar restaurant, painting rooms, music, a library, a women's boutique and cafeteria. On the upper floors were a telephone exchange, conference room, classrooms for patients, a nursing school, and 3 panoramic terraces. It sounds pretty nice for the time, actually. I'm glad they had a place to gather and pretend that life was normal, because outside life was very much so not normal. Mussolini's Fasci di Combattimento were organizing against socialist groups around the country. In April 1919, the fascists burned down the socialist newspaper offices of Levante, killing 4 people. It was the first, but not the last, attack on press agencies that Mussolini disagreed with. Before long, militias of new fascist members popped up in regions like Tuscany, where Volterra was located, in Emilia and Puglia. The fascists only strengthened in numbers and in power. By the fall of 1920, according to Britannica, they had dismantled socialist and Catholic labor unions and, often with police collusion, began to overthrow newly elected local councils. The fascist squads dressed in black-shirted uniforms and used violence to destroy the organizations they opposed. Thousands of people were beaten, killed, or, and this one seems particularly strange, forced to drink castor oil and run out of town. They looted or burned down offices and homes of government officials. They led an insurrection, invading the council chamber in which 9 people died. In the middle of all this, the government said, "You know who we need right now? Giolitti. He'd know what to do." And so Giolitti began his 5th and final term as prime minister in 1920. Once again, he appointed centrist cabinet members in an attempt to balance out the drama that was unfolding around him. But unfortunately, even Giolitti was no match for fascism. In fact, he sort of welcomed them, or at least he didn't try and stop the forceful marches and infiltrations. This may have been his undoing, as he lost an election in 1921 and was forced to resign. His friend, Luigi Facta, took over as prime minister after Giolitti. However, 1921 and 1922, called the Biennio Nero, or 2 Black Years, involved fascists destroying anyone who opposed them. Union organizations were crushed. Fascist members were strategically placed in certain government jobs, like postal administrative workers, taxi drivers, and trade unions. It was very well planned. And then came October 1922. The former Prime Minister Antonio Salandra warned the current Prime Minister Luigi Facta that Mussolini was preparing to march on Rome and would demand his resignation. Facta didn't believe him, thinking that Mussolini was a nice enough guy. He'll collaborate with me. Explain that to the 25,000 fascists waiting just outside Rome. Facta decided that he would resign, but pleaded to King Victor Emmanuel to declare martial law on Rome. Did you forget, by the way, that there was a king? He's been pretty quiet throughout this whole story. Anyway, the king said no. Instead, he handed over power to Mussolini on October 28, 1922. Fantastic. By 1923, Mussolini had set up brand new rules and laws. First, there would be no more elections. Elections are abolished. Free speech and free association disappeared. Opposition parties disappeared. A special tribunal was set up for opponents of fascism, and there were severe controls placed throughout the country. In short, Mussolini's mission was to, quote, bring Italy back to the glories of imperial Rome, end quote. And his vision wasn't all bad. He had 4 main battles that he hoped to win: the battle on grain, the battle on births, the battle on land, and the battle on the lira, the Italian currency. The battle on grain is the one that had the most devastating effect on the asylum in Volterra, so I'll briefly discuss that one. In an effort for Italy to be more independent and self-sustaining, Mussolini placed a high tariff, nearly 100% higher than the year before, on wheat. Initially, the production of wheat increased, and it looked like he would have a positive outcome. But Italy still relied on fertilizer from other countries, so it wasn't sustainable. The trade-off for the increase in wheat meant decreased trade of their most exported items like wine, cheese, and fruit. The result was a food scarcity, and the food that was available was priced higher than before. Obviously, with food being further rationed and more expensive, that would have a direct impact on the asylum and its ability to feed patients sufficiently. The economy suffered greatly under Mussolini's leadership. By 1926, the value of the lira had plummeted. Exports were down, unemployment was high, wages were either cut or frozen. Industries that had previously relied on foreign markets declined. In short, Italy was heading for a severe economic depression. At Volterra, however, construction had started on a new building. That's the sad truth about economic hardship. The industries that thrive in the midst of it are alcohol production and mental health treatment. In 1927, the Charcot Pavilion was completed. And it's really quite a beautiful building in a neo-Gothic style with arched windows. It was originally designed to be a women's agricultural colony, as it was surrounded by vegetable gardens and fields cultivated with fruit trees. The ground floor for the Charcot Pavilion was intended for staff offices, clinics, common areas, and some patient residences. For many years, there was a parlor room that served as a place where family members could stay to visit their hospitalized loved ones for extended periods of time. The ground floor also had a cafeteria where patients were only allowed to use a spoon and a tin bowl. The first floor was made up of mostly patient dormitories. Below one of the ground floor wings was the lowest level of the Charcot Pavilion. This area contained a large space that was known as the Orange Room, which, ironically, was covered in light blue tiles. This space was used for dance parties and events that would include patients, of course, as well as staff and patients' family members. Dr. Scabbia put together a well-known event called the Carnival of the Madmen. And I wish there were more information about this because I'm quite curious. All the website said was that it was a delight to the patients, so I guess that's good. The 1930s saw another construction boom at Volterra. In 1930, the Ferry Pavilion had been built. This was a forensic building designed to house the criminally insane, and it was one of the first in Italy to house this population. It housed only male residents. And it's worth noting that in 1934, there were 350 patients residing in Feri. By 1939, there were over 1,000, many of whom were political opponents. In 1933, the Maragliano Pavilion was completed. This building served as a male tuberculosis isolation ward. Also in 1933, Dr. Scabbia created his own currency for patients to use. And I'm curious about this too, because that's all the information that was given. And I wonder if it was set up like a token economy, which some hospitals still use, where patients can earn points or hospital dollars for good behavior, and then they can spend that at stores. I don't know that for sure in Volterra's case, but that's what some places still do today. By the 1930s, fascism dominated daily life in Italy. Mussolini had had the press tightly censored. There were now new textbooks given for schools to teach from. There were fascist youth movements throughout the country that were described as, quote, semi-compulsory, so take that as you will. But hey, it wasn't all bad. The fascist regime put together some mean concerts and sporting events. Again, you have to get buy-in from people somehow, right? And the dominance of fascism affected Dr. Scabbia and Volterra as well. Dr. Scabbia himself opposed fascism, which was dangerous, considering that he held a high state-sponsored position. From 1927 to 1929, several anonymous letters had been sent in Volterra that defamed Dr. Scabbia. In the early 1930s, the situation worsened and became more violent and hostile. No specific details were given about what happened, but given the fascist regime's history of burning down buildings and beating people up, we can make inferences at what may have happened or what may have at least been threatened. Since the asylum was run by government commissioners who were likely fascist, instead of administrators, Dr. Scabbia was subjected to numerous investigations and unfounded accusations. Tensions increased until he was forced to retire in 1934, after 34 years on the job. He was also asked to leave his residence on the hospital grounds. As a side note, remember that when Dr. Scabbia had first started his job at Volterra, there were just over 200 patients at the asylum. By the time he was forced to retire, there were 3,700. Not long after his retirement, on October 20th, 1943, Dr. Scabbia died unexpectedly of a heart attack. He was 66 years old. He was remembered as intelligent, with great energy, a good administrator. And Dr. Giovanni de Nigris took over his place. That same year, 1934, the Tanzi Pavilion was completed. This building was large and imposing, one of the most advanced medical buildings of its time. It was built to accommodate patients who had been referred to occupational therapy and agriculture. This would end up being an invaluable resource during later wartime food shortages. At one point, the Tanzi Pavilion and the patients who resided there helped feed the entire city of Volterra. In 1935, two buildings were completed, the Bianchi Pavilion and the Bacelli Pavilion. The Bianchi Pavilion was built as a residence for women patients, and the Bacelli Pavilion was a medical unit. The central section of the building housed the library and scientific laboratories. Bacelli also housed the women's nursing ward, which was a unit that cared for acute medical needs. Meanwhile, in national news, by 1935, Mussolini wanted Italy to be even more self-sufficient, so he placed increased sanctions on the economy. This led to a corresponding increase in cartels and monopolies, which led to budget deficits, huge tax increases, and capital levies. No doubt Italians started to feel the walls close in around them. They moved increasingly into cities, which again led to overcrowding and increased crime. And to top it all off, Mussolini put an anti-migration law into place in 1938, which restricted movement even within the country. Emigration had decreased, so now there was nowhere for people to go. Even the language changed around this time. As a means of becoming more Italy-centric, foreign words were replaced with Italian equivalents. Bordeaux wine became Barolo. Film became pellicola, and German place names were Italianized. According to Britannica, quote, the walls of offices, schools, and public buildings were covered with slogans and murals paying homage to Mussolini and fascism, such as Mussolini is always right, or better to live one day as a lion than 100 years as a sheep, end quote. 1938 also saw the introduction of anti-Semitic laws. Jewish folks were seen as unpatriotic and were excluded from government jobs and military positions. Like Jews in Nazi Germany, Jewish folks in Italy were forced to register. There were some anti-fascist movements during this time, but the numbers were really too small to make any difference. There were fascist regime members in all levels of government, and soon they put out spies to look for anti-fascist dissenters. These dissenters were imprisoned, sent to asylums, or exiled to remote islands. Now, asylums around the country, including the one in Volterra, were receiving not only mentally ill folks, but those deemed to be political enemies. At Volterra, these political prisoners were kept at Ferri, the ward reserved for the criminally insane. And this is where the lines between Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany really start to blur. And in fact, in 1939, Mussolini entered a formal military alliance with Adolf Hitler. And by 1940, Italy had joined World War II on the German side. Of course, this had an impact on Volterra. The portions of food decreased substantially due to rations. One patient, whom the Volterra website calls Antonio, said that he weighed only 34 kilos, or just under 75 pounds, in 1943. He had been at the asylum for 3 years. Patients were literally starving, and clearly the war was taking a toll. In 1940, Dr. Umberto Sarteschi became the superintendent of the Volterra Asylum. Now, he has an interesting story that's often told about him. At his residence, there were 4 people who worked for him: a cook, a maid, a gardener, and a criminally insane patient. Wait, what? This patient had been hospitalized after killing a rival persecutor, but Dr. Sarteschi hired him to serve as his bodyguard. As one story goes, when Dr. Sarteschi was sick in bed with the flu, the patient laid on a mattress in front of his bedroom door in order to protect him. A little strange, sure, but apparently that's what he wanted. Meanwhile, the war was blazing on. Morale was low after losing several battles and needed to be bailed out by German troops. Airstrikes had taken out factories in northern Italy, which limited production of weapons. There was a huge scarcity of guns, clothing, food, vehicles, and fuel. Meanwhile, Italy had lost its colonial conquests in northern and eastern Africa, and civilians were able to listen in to Radio Vatican or Radio London to get more accurate details of what was actually happening. This started a resistance movement around 1943 to overthrow fascism. By the summer of 1943, things were looking pretty grim for Italy. The Fascist Grand Council met in Rome in July and passed a motion asking the king to resume his full constitutional powers and to dismiss Mussolini. Again, did you forget there was a king? And that's what happened. Mussolini was dismissed as the Duce and arrested. The same day, the king appointed Pietro Badoglio as prime minister. Around the country, statues of Mussolini were torn down, fascist symbols were removed, and political prisoners were released. It was believed that the end of Mussolini's reign also meant the end of the war, but not quite. On September 3rd, 1943, Badoglio, I think I said it wrong the first time, agreed to an armistice between Italy and the Allied armed forces. This started chaos. Some Italians joined the Allies in a fight against the Germans. Others deserted or surrendered to the Germans. Still others refused to switch sides and joined the Germans. Meanwhile, Mussolini had been moved all over the country in an attempt to conceal his location from the Germans. 2 months after his arrest, he was rescued from his prison, which saved him from being turned over to the Allies. Hitler was hoping to arrest the king and the rest of the government and restore power to Mussolini, but that didn't happen. A few days after his prison break, Mussolini met with Hitler. Mussolini looked tired and haggard and lacked energy. He finally agreed to set up a new regime, the Italian Social Republic, where he would continue to fight for the lands he had lost. You just want to tell the guy, give it up. You've already lost, but I guess he thought he'd give it one last go. He talked a big game, as if he were still fully in control and in power. But in reality, Mussolini was basically under house arrest in Lake Garda, where he stayed for about a year and a half. He ordered the execution of a few government officials who had not remained loyal to him. By the end of April 1945, Allied troopers were advancing into northern Italy, and the collapse of Mussolini's new regime was imminent. He took his mistress and attempted to flee to Switzerland, but they were stopped and arrested at Lake Como. They were subsequently handed over to Allied forces, and on April 28, 1945, Mussolini, his mistress, and 15 other members of the Italian Social Republic were executed by firing squad. Even more disturbing, perhaps, is that their bodies were collected and taken to Milan, where they were dumped in the town square. The people saw them and came and kicked and spat on the corpses, then hung the bodies upside down from a roof so people could throw stones at them. Yeesh, they really did not like that guy. In May 1945, World War II ended in Europe, and some peace was restored to the area. The long regime of Benito Mussolini, which had lasted 21 years, was finally over. In 1946, the king finally abdicated his throne. For a brief while, his son took over, but the people voted to begin a republic. In a way, this served as punishment for the king's support of Mussolini. On January 1st, 1948, the Italian Republic was born. And that's where I'm going to pause the story of the Volterra Lunatic Asylum. I know there was a lot of Italian history in this episode, but I think it's important to contextualize the history of the asylum within the chaos and madness that was happening around them. It was really a very turbulent time. So next week, we'll close out the history of Volterra with more mental health laws and an overview of treatments at the asylum. As always, thank you so much for listening. This was a really interesting episode to research and write about, so I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to hear more about Volterra, I'm adding some journal entries from a former patient who was there during World War II on the Patreon page. So if you already support the show on Patreon, you can go ahead and start listening to those. And if you don't yet support the show on Patreon, that's a good reason to head on over there. Special thanks this week to my Italy travel buddy, Joe, for her review on Apple Podcasts. Thank you so much, Joe. Remember to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you're listening, but especially if that's on Apple Podcasts. That really does help other people find and listen to the show. So make sure to come back for next week's episode on Volterra Lunatic Asylum. And of course, remember the words of Maya Angelou. Do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. Until next time. Thank you so much for listening to Behind the Walls of the World's Psychiatric Hospitals. Once again, I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup. Cover image is by Christopher Payne. Check out my website at behindthewallspodcast.buzzsprout.com. Follow the podcast and learn more on Facebook at Behind the Walls Podcast and Instagram at Behind the Walls Pod. For questions or recommendations, email me at behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com. You can find new episodes every Monday on Amazon Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you're listening right now. If you like the show, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. It helps other people find and listen to the show, and I would be so grateful. Please stay tuned for more episodes of Behind the Walls of the World's Psychiatric Hospitals. Until next time.